The truth about spiritual overthinking isn't that you think too much. It's that you've been carrying a weight God never asked you to carry. Every decision feels dangerous. Every prayer turns into another round of questions. You keep asking God for clarity, but the more you analyze, the more trapped you feel inside your own mind. You're terrified of getting it wrong, missing His will, taking the wrong step, and somewhere beneath all that thinking, peace has quietly disappeared. But what if the voice demanding absolute certainty isn't God's voice at all, and the thing keeping you stuck has been disguised as wisdom this entire time? You love God. That is what makes this struggle so difficult to admit. If you did not care about honoring Him, you would not spend so much time thinking about every decision. If you did not want His will, you would not replay conversations in your mind long after they end. If your faith meant nothing to you, you would not keep asking yourself whether you are hearing Him correctly. And yet, somewhere along the way, something changed. What began as a sincere desire to follow God became an exhausting cycle of analysis. Now every choice feels loaded with pressure. You wonder whether God is leading you or whether it is just your own thoughts. You question whether that opportunity is an answer to prayer or a distraction. You examine your feelings, then examine your examination of your feelings. You pray about something, then pray again because you are not sure if the first prayer was enough. You ask for wisdom, but after receiving no immediate certainty, you begin searching for signs. You notice a coincidence and wonder if it means something. You hear a sermon and wonder if God is speaking directly to your situation. You read a verse and spend hours trying to determine whether it is guidance or simply encouragement. The result is not peace. The result is exhaustion. What makes spiritual overthinking so difficult to recognize is that it often wears the clothing of faith. From the outside, it looks responsible, it looks careful, it looks spiritual. After all, who could criticize someone for wanting to follow God correctly? Who could object to someone who sincerely wants to avoid mistakes? Who could question someone who wants to be obedient? But beneath the surface, there is often a hidden fear that few people talk about. A fear that whispers, what if I miss God's will? What if I make the wrong choice? What if one mistake ruins everything? What if God wanted me to go left and I went right? What if I misunderstood Him? The mind begins searching for certainty, not guidance, not wisdom. Certainty, and those are not the same thing. The problem is that certainty feels safe. If you could somehow know every outcome before taking a step, you would feel protected. If you could guarantee success before moving forward, you would feel secure. If you could remove all possibility of failure, disappointment, or pain, you would finally relax. At least that is what you tell yourself. So you think harder, you analyze longer, you search deeper, you replay possibilities again and again. But instead of becoming clearer, everything becomes more confusing. Instead of becoming stronger, you become more tired. Instead of feeling closer to God, you feel trapped inside your own mind. Perhaps you have experienced moments when you wanted to make a simple decision, but it became a spiritual puzzle. A conversation that should have taken 5 minutes turns into hours of mental review. A choice that should have required prayer and wisdom becomes a weeks-long investigation. A season that should have been lived becomes a season that is endlessly analyzed. And the strange thing is that the more answers you find, the more questions seem to appear. You solve one uncertainty only to discover 3 more. You close one mental loop only to open 5 others. Your mind never reaches the destination. It keeps promising, because overthinking always makes the same promise. Just think about it a little more. Just analyze one more angle. Just make sure. Just be certain. But certainty never arrives. Instead, anxiety finds new material to work with. What makes this especially painful for believers is that overthinking can affect the way they view God Himself. Without realizing it, many people begin to imagine God as someone who is waiting for them to make a mistake, someone who is difficult to understand, someone who hides His will behind endless complexity, someone who expects perfect performance, someone who is constantly testing them. As a result, faith slowly becomes stressful. Prayer becomes tense. Decision-making becomes frightening. The future becomes intimidating. And the relationship that was supposed to bring peace begins to feel like pressure. Maybe you have felt that pressure. Maybe You have sat awake at night replaying scenarios that have not even happened. Maybe you have asked God the same question hundreds of times because you were afraid of moving forward without complete confidence. Maybe you have found yourself trapped between options, unable to choose because every possibility carries the weight of spiritual consequences. Maybe you have convinced yourself that if you think hard enough, eventually you will unlock the answer. But what if that is not how God intended you to live? What if the problem is not that God is withholding guidance? What if the problem is something deeper? There is a hidden cost to spiritual overthinking that many people never recognize. It steals your ability to be present. While your body lives today, your mind lives somewhere else. You are constantly evaluating tomorrow, constantly preparing for possibilities, constantly searching for outcomes, constantly managing uncertainty. Meanwhile, today's blessings pass by unnoticed. Today's opportunities remain untouched. Today's grace goes unreceived because your attention is consumed by what might happen later. This creates a cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. The more uncertain you feel, the more you think. The more you think, the more possibilities you discover. The more possibilities you discover, the more uncertain you feel. And around it goes. Many believers assume this cycle is evidence of spiritual seriousness. They assume that the person who worries the most must care the most. They assume that the person who analyzes everything must be the most mature. But is that really true? Consider how often Jesus invited people into trust, not perfect understanding. Trust, not complete certainty. Trust, not exhaustive explanations. Trust, again and again. The invitation was relational before it was informational. Yet many of us spend enormous amounts of energy pursuing information while neglecting trust. We keep looking for the next clue, the next confirmation, the next sign, the next feeling, the next certainty, as if one more piece of evidence will finally quiet the storm inside our minds. But what if the storm is not caused by lack of information? What if it is caused by something else entirely? This is where the struggle becomes uncomfortable, because spiritual overthinking often feels like a wisdom problem. But what if it is actually a controlled problem? That possibility is difficult to face, not because you are rebellious, not because you do not love God, but because the desire for certainty can quietly become the desire for control. And control feels safer than faith. Control feels stronger than surrender. Control feels more predictable than trust. The heart begins believing that if it can gather enough information, it can eliminate risk. If it can think enough, it can avoid pain. If it can analyze enough, it can guarantee success. But life does not work that way, and neither does faith. Somewhere beneath all the mental activity, a deeper question is waiting to be answered. A question that changes everything. What if God never intended you to carry the burden of certainty in the first place? What if the exhausting pressure you feel was never a burden He asked you to bear? What if your endless search for clarity is keeping you from experiencing the very peace you are looking for? And what if the voice you have been listening to most carefully is not God's voice at all, but the voice of fear, disguised as wisdom? That question changes the entire conversation. Because before you can understand why overthinking has become such a powerful force in your life, you must first learn to recognize something many believers miss. Not every thought that sounds spiritual is actually coming from faith. And that is where the journey truly begins. You may have assumed that every persistent thought deserves your attention. After all, if a thought keeps returning, it must be important, right? If it feels urgent, it must require action. If it creates concern, it must be warning you about something. This is one of the most common assumptions behind spiritual overthinking. The mind begins treating every anxious thought as if it carries spiritual significance. Every fear becomes a possibility to investigate. Every uncertainty becomes a problem to solve. Every uncomfortable feeling becomes a message to decode. And before long, fear starts sounding remarkably spiritual. That is what makes this struggle so deceptive. Fear rarely introduces itself as fear. Instead, it often disguises itself as responsibility. It says things like, you need to be careful. You need to think this through. You need to make sure you can't afford to get this wrong. At first, those statements sound reasonable. In fact, they may even sound wise. But there is a subtle difference between wisdom and fear. Wisdom leads you toward clarity. Fear traps you in endless evaluation. Wisdom helps you move forward. Fear keeps moving the finish line. Wisdom creates peace, even when answers are incomplete. Fear demands answers before peace is allowed. This distinction is crucial because many believers spend years listening to fear while believing they are listening to discernment. They mistake anxiety for spiritual sensitivity. They mistake worry for wisdom. They mistake mental pressure for conviction. Yet when you look closely at how God works throughout Scripture, a different pattern emerges. God certainly warns. God certainly corrects. God certainly guides. But His guidance does not operate through panic. His leadership does not produce chaos. His direction does not depend on constant mental torment. When God leads, there is often challenge. There is often stretching. There is often uncertainty. But there is not the crushing confusion that fear creates. That realization can be difficult because many people have become so familiar with anxious thinking that they assume it is normal. They wake up worried. They go to sleep worried. They pray worried. They make decisions worried. Eventually, they begin viewing worry as part of being spiritually responsible. But think about what that does to your relationship with God. If every decision must be perfectly analyzed, then every decision becomes frightening. If every choice carries the possibility of ruining God's plan, then life becomes a minefield. If every uncertain situation requires complete understanding, then peace becomes impossible. And yet God never intended faith to function that way. Consider how often human beings want certainty, while God invites trust. That tension appears again and again. People want complete explanations. God offers the next step. People want the full map. God provides enough light for the path directly ahead. People want guarantees. God offers His presence. The difference is enormous. One approach depends on control. The other depends on relationship. This is why overthinking becomes such a powerful trap. The overthinking mind believes more analogous will create safety, but in reality, more analogous often creates more fear, because fear feeds on possibilities. And possibilities never end. For every answer fear receives, it creates another question. What if this happens? But what if that happens? What if I misunderstood? What if circumstances change? What if I'm wrong? Fear is never satisfied. It survives by keeping uncertainty alive. That is why some people spend years searching for reassurance, yet never feel reassured. The issue is not the absence of answers. The issue is the presence of fear. And fear has a remarkable ability to borrow spiritual language. It can make you feel noble for worrying. It can make you feel responsible for obsessing. It can make you feel wise for remaining stuck. Meanwhile, the peace God wants to give you remains just outside the cycle. One of the most important spiritual discoveries you can make is learning that not every thought deserves equal trust. Just because a thought enters your mind does not mean it speaks truth. Just because a thought feels urgent does not mean it is important. Just because a thought produces emotion does not mean it comes from God. This may seem obvious, but many believers live as though every thought is evidence. Every fear is treated as a warning. Every doubt is treated as a revelation. Every concern is treated as discernment. The result is emotional exhaustion, because the mind was never designed to carry that burden. Think about how many times you have argued with yourself internally. One thought says move forward. Another says wait. One thought says trust God. Another says prepare for disaster. One thought remembers God's faithfulness. Another imagines everything going wrong. Hours pass, days pass, sometimes weeks pass, yet nothing changes except your level of exhaustion. Why? Because fear thrives in circles. Faith moves forward. Fear keeps reviewing. Faith obeys. Fear postpones. Faith trusts. Fear calculates. This does not mean believers should be reckless. It does not mean wisdom is unnecessary. It does not mean careful thinking is wrong. God gave you a mind for a reason. Wisdom matters. Counsel matters. Prayer matters. Discernment matters. But there is a difference between thoughtful reflection and endless mental captivity. One leads to action, the other leads to paralysis. One produces peace, the other produces anxiety. One strengthens trust, the other strengthens fear. Many people discovered that they are not actually waiting on God. They are waiting for fear to stop talking, and fear never stops talking on its own. That realization becomes a turning point because it forces a difficult question. What voice have you been following? The voice that constantly demands certainty. The voice that always assumes the worst. The voice that insists disaster is one mistake away. The voice that keeps telling you that God's will is fragile and easy to destroy. Or the voice of a faithful Father who remains sovereign, even when you do not know everything. That question matters because your image of God shapes everything else. If you see God as impossible to please, you will constantly overlay. If you see Him as waiting for mistakes, you will live in fear. If you see Him as distant and difficult to understand, you will spend your life searching for hidden clues. But what if God is more faithful than you imagine? What if His ability to guide you is greater than your ability to misunderstand Him? What if His sovereignty is stronger than your imperfections? What if His love is not dependent on your flawless decision-making? Those possibilities begin to weaken fear's grip, because fear survives by convincing you that everything depends on you. Faith grows when you realize everything ultimately depends on God. That does not remove responsibility. It simply puts responsibility in its proper place. You are responsible for seeking God. You are responsible for prayer. You are responsible for wisdom. You are responsible for obedience, but you were never responsible for controlling every outcome. You were never responsible for guaranteeing the future. You are never responsible for possessing perfect certainty. Only God carries those burdens. And when you try to carry them yourself, the weight becomes crushing. This is where many believers begin experiencing a small but powerful revelation. The exhaustion they feel is not coming from following God. It is coming from trying to do God's job, trying to know everything, trying to control everything, trying to predict everything, trying to guarantee everything. No wonder the mind becomes tired. No wonder peace feels distant. No wonder prayer starts feeling heavy. But another question remains. If overthinking is fueled by fear, what happens when God seems silent? What happens when you genuinely seek Him and still do not receive immediate answers? What happens when heaven feels quiet? Because for many people, that is exactly where overthinking becomes strongest. And understanding God's silence may reveal something far more important than the answers you have been searching for. There is a moment that almost every believer encounters sooner or later. A moment when the prayers have been offered, the questions have been asked, the seeking has been sincere, and yet the answer does not come. Days pass, weeks pass, sometimes months pass, sometimes even longer, and the silence begins to feel louder than any words. This is often where spiritual overthinking reaches its highest intensity. When God seems silent, the mind becomes desperate to fill the gap. Questions multiply, doubts increase, possibilities expand. The heart starts searching everywhere for clues. Maybe you have experienced this. You prayed for direction, but received no clear answer. You asked God what to do, but the path remained uncertain. You pleaded for confirmation, yet nothing seemed to happen. And because the silence felt uncomfortable, your mind began working overtime. You searched for hidden meanings. You analyzed circumstances. You replayed conversations. You examined every emotion. You tried to solve through thinking what only God could reveal through timing. The silence felt like a problem, and every problem, according to the logic of overthinking, must be solved. But what if silence is not always a problem? What if one of the greatest misunderstandings in the Christian life is the belief that God's silence automatically means God's absence? This misunderstanding has caused enormous pain for many believers, because when heaven feels quiet, people often create explanations that are far more frightening than reality. Maybe God is disappointed with me. Maybe I missed His will. Maybe I made a mistake. Maybe He is ignoring me. Maybe He has abandoned me. Maybe I am not spiritual enough. Maybe He is withholding something because I failed Him. Notice what happens. The absence of information becomes filled with assumptions, and almost always those assumptions lean toward fear rather than faith. The human mind struggles with unanswered questions. It prefers painful certainty over unresolved waiting. At least certainty feels stable. Waiting feels vulnerable. Waiting forces trust. And trust is exactly what overthinking tries to avoid. Because overthinking believes that enough analysis can replace trust yet again and again. Scripture reveals a different reality. God often works in seasons where understanding is incomplete. He often develops people before he directs them. He often transforms hearts before he changes circumstances. He often prepares individuals for answers long before those answers arrive. This is difficult for modern minds because we are conditioned to expect immediate results, immediate information, immediate responses, immediate clarity, immediate certainty. But spiritual growth rarely follows that pattern. Growth frequently occurs in places where answers are delayed, and that delay is not meaningless. Think about what happens during waiting. The first thing exposed is expectation. You begin discovering what you truly believe about God. Do you trust Him only when He responds quickly? Do you trust Him only when His plans match yours? Do you trust Him only when the path is obvious? Or do you trust Him because of who He is? Those are very different foundations. Many people believe their faith is strong until certainty disappears. Then they discover that much of their confidence was actually resting on understanding. As long as life made sense, they felt secure. As long as His answers arrived, they felt peaceful. As long as the future looked clear, they felt faithful. But when clarity vanished, fear surfaced. Not because God changed, because their foundation was being revealed. This is one reason seasons of silence can be spiritually significant. Silence exposes where trust is truly placed, and sometimes that revelation is uncomfortable. Perhaps you have noticed that the longer uncertainty lasts, the more tempting it becomes to take control. You want to force an answer, force a decision, force a breakthrough, force clarity. Anything feels better than waiting. Yet some of God's deepest work happens in waiting. Not because waiting itself is magical, but because waiting reveals the condition of the heart. When answers are delayed, control begins losing its power. You realize there are situations you cannot solve, questions you cannot answer, outcomes you cannot guarantee, future events you cannot predict. And slowly, painfully, the illusion of control begins to crack. That process rarely feels pleasant, but it can be incredibly transformative. Because God is not merely interested in giving directions. He is interested in forming trust. Many believers spend their lives asking, what is God trying to tell me? Sometimes the more important question is, what is God trying to develop in me? Those questions lead in different directions. The first seeks information. The second seeks transformation. And transformation often requires time. Consider how often God works beneath the surface. Seeds grow underground before they appear above the soil. Foundations are laid before buildings become visible. Character develops before calling is fully revealed. Much of God's work happens in places human eyes cannot easily see. Yet overthinking struggles with invisible progress. The overthinking mind wants evidence, proof, movement, confirmation, something measurable, something observable, something immediate. But faith frequently operates without those comforts. That is why waiting can feel so challenging. You are forced to live without the certainty your mind craves. And yet something remarkable can happen there. If you allow it, the silence that once felt threatening can begin teaching trust. The waiting that once felt pointless can begin producing endurance. The uncertainty that once felt unbearable can begin strengthening faith. Not because answers suddenly appear, but because your relationship with God deepens. At first, many believers approach prayer during uncertain seasons, as if they are conducting an investigation. They gather evidence, collect clues, search for signals. They want information. And when information does not come, frustration grows. But eventually some people discover something surprising. God's greatest gift during waiting is often not information. It is Himself, His presence, His faithfulness, His peace. The relationship becomes deeper than the answers. This does not mean questions disappear. It does not mean uncertainty becomes enjoyable. It does not mean the desire for guidance vanishes. But something changes. You stop treating God like a puzzle to solve. You begin relating to Him as a father to trust. And that shift changes everything. Because a child does not need to understand every detail to trust a loving father. The child may not know the route, may not know the timing, may not know the destination. But trust allows movement even without complete understanding. This is the lesson overthinking struggles to accept. Faith was never built upon possessing every answer. Faith grows when answers are incomplete. Anyone can feel secure when everything makes sense. Trust becomes meaningful when it continues, despite uncertainty. And perhaps that is why some seasons remain unresolved longer than we would prefer. Not because God enjoys withholding answers, not because He has forgotten you, not because He is distant, but because He is doing a deeper work than simply giving information. Still, there is another challenge that keeps many believers trapped. Even when they begin learning to trust God's silence, their minds continue racing toward the future. Tomorrow's problems, tomorrow's fears, tomorrow's uncertainties. And that is where overthinking often finds its strongest fuel. Because the mind was never designed to carry the weight of a future that has not arrived yet. One of the most exhausting things about spiritual overthinking is that it rarely stays in the present. It is almost always traveling somewhere else. Into tomorrow, into next month, into next year, into possibilities that have not happened, into scenarios that may never happen. The mind begins living in futures that do not exist yet. And while your body remains here, your thoughts race ahead, carrying burdens you were never meant to carry. Perhaps you know exactly what this feels like. A simple decision appears in front of you, but instead of dealing with today's choice, your mind immediately starts building entire futures around it. If I choose this path, what happens in 6 months? What if things go wrong? What if I regret it? What if I discover later that I misunderstood God? What if this creates problems I cannot see right now? What if I disappoint people? What if I fail? Before long, a decision that belongs in the present becomes connected to dozens of imaginary futures. The weight becomes overwhelming, not because of today's reality, because of tomorrow's possibilities. This is one of fear's favorite strategies. Fear rarely focuses on what is happening now. It focuses on what might happen later. It survives by creating imagined futures and then convincing you they are already real. The mind reacts emotionally to scenarios that have never occurred. The heart begins carrying pain that does not yet exist. Stress develops over outcomes that may never happen. And because the future is limitless, fear always has new material to work with. There is always another possibility, another concern, another risk, another uncertainty. This is why overthinking feels endless. You cannot solve every future because every future has infinite variables. Yet many believers spend years trying. They attempt to mentally manage tomorrow before it arrives. They attempt to predict every outcome. They attempt to prepare for every possibility. They attempt to eliminate every uncertainty, and in doing so, they gradually become exhausted, not because life is too heavy, because they are carrying more than life requires. The reality is that the human mind was never designed to carry tomorrow's burdens today. God did not create you to live months ahead of yourself. He did not create you to mentally occupy every possible future. He created you to walk with Him one day at a time. That truth sounds simple. Yet it directly challenges the entire system of because overthinking says, prepare for everything. Faith says, trust God for today. Overthinking says, figure out the entire journey. Faith says, take the next faithful step. Overthinking says, you need answers before moving. Faith says, you need trust before moving. Notice how different those approaches are. One seeks control. The other seeks dependence. And dependence is uncomfortable for people who have spent years trying to manage uncertainty through thinking. Many believers unknowingly believe that worrying about the future is helping them. It feels productive. It feels responsible. It feels like preparation. But preparation and worry are not the same thing. Preparation deals with what can be done. Worry obsesses over what cannot be controlled. Preparation leads to action. Worry leads to mental exhaustion. Preparation solves practical problems. Worry creates emotional ones. The distinction matters because fear often disguises worry as preparation. It tells you that your anxiety is helping, that your mental rehearsal is protecting you, that your endless analysis is keeping you safe. But look honestly at the results. Has all the worrying created peace? Has all the overthinking removed uncertainty? Has all the analysis guaranteed outcomes? Or has it mostly created fatigue? Many people eventually realize that the vast majority of the things they worried about never happened. The disasters never arrived. The failures never occurred. The fears never became reality. Yet the emotional energy spent worrying was very real. The exhaustion was real. The stress was real. The sleepless nights were real. Fear collected a price for futures that never existed. This is one reason spiritual overthinking becomes so destructive. It steals strength from today to pay for tomorrow, and tomorrow may never send the bill. Meanwhile, today's opportunities suffer. Today's relationships suffer. Today's peace suffers. Today's faith suffers. Because your attention has been transferred into an imaginary future, God's pattern is very different. Again and again, He provides what is needed for the current season, not necessarily for the next 10 years, not necessarily for every future possibility. For today. This frustrates the overthinking mind because it wants a complete guarantee. It wants permanent certainty. It wants total visibility. Yet God often gives enough grace for the present moment, enough wisdom for today's decision, enough strength for today's challenge, enough peace for today's burden. Why? Because dependence grows when we learn to trust Him daily. If God showed you every detail of your future, trust would become unnecessary. If He removed every uncertainty, faith would no longer be required. If He explained every outcome, surrender would lose much of its meaning. But instead, He invites you into a relationship where trust is renewed again and again, not once, daily. This is where many believers discover a painful truth. Much of their anxiety comes not from today's responsibilities, but from tomorrow's possibilities. And there is a profound difference between the two. Today's responsibilities can often be handled. Tomorrow's possibilities cannot. Today's responsibilities have limits. Tomorrow's possibilities are endless. Today's responsibilities invite action. Tomorrow's possibilities invite speculation. One is manageable, the other is overwhelming. When those two become confused, anxiety grows rapidly. You start treating imagined problems as current responsibilities. You begin carrying burdens God never assigned to you. You become emotionally invested in situations that do not exist. And eventually, your mind feels overloaded, not because life is impossible, because you have accepted responsibilities that belong to God. This realization creates an important shift. Instead of asking, "How do I control tomorrow?" you begin asking, "How can I trust God today?" Instead of demanding certainty about the future, you begin seeking faithfulness in the present. Instead of trying to manage every outcome, you begin focusing on the next act of obedience. That shift sounds small, but it changes everything. Because peace is rarely found in controlling the future. Peace is found in trusting the one who already holds it. Still, there is another subtle trap many believers encounter. Even after they begin releasing future fears, they often remain stuck waiting for more information, more confirmation, more clarity, more certainty. They convince themselves they cannot move forward until they know more. But what if the issue is not lack of information? What if God has already revealed enough for the next step? What if wisdom is not found in knowing everything, but in obeying what has already been made clear? That question becomes the next breakthrough in the journey from overthinking to trust. One of the most frustrating experiences for a believer is feeling stuck between action and uncertainty. You want to move forward. You want to obey God. You want to do what is right. But part of you keeps insisting that you need more information first, more confirmation, more clarity, more reassurance, more certainty. So you wait and wait and wait, not because God told you to wait, because fear told you that you are not ready. This is one of the most subtle ways spiritual overthinking keeps people trapped. It convinces them that obedience should only begin after every question has been answered. It teaches them to believe that confidence comes before action. But often, God works in exactly the opposite way. Confidence frequently grows through obedience, not before it. That truth challenges the overthinking mind because it wants guarantees. It wants to know exactly how things will unfold. It wants to see the destination before taking the first step. It wants certainty before movement. Yet many of the most important moments of spiritual growth happen when people move forward with incomplete understanding. Not recklessly, not carelessly, not foolishly, but faithfully. There is a difference. Faith is not ignoring wisdom. Faith is acting on the wisdom God has already provided. Overthinking, however, constantly demands additional information. It keeps saying, "Not yet. You need more clarity. You need another sign. You need one more confirmation. You need to be absolutely sure." The problem is that absolute certainty is rarely available. If that were the requirement for obedience, very few people would ever move forward. Think about how many areas of life operate without complete certainty. You build relationships without knowing every future outcome. You pursue opportunities without possessing every answer. You make commitments without seeing every detail ahead. Life itself requires movement in the presence of uncertainty. The spiritual life is no different. Yet many believers hold themselves to a standard God never established. They expect themselves to know what only God knows. They expect themselves to predict what only God can see. They expect themselves to possess certainty that belongs only to Him. As a result, they become not because they lack guidance, because they demand more guidance than God has chosen to provide. This is where an important question emerges. What has God already made clear? Not what you wish He would reveal, not what you hope to know someday, not what remains uncertain. What has He already revealed? This question changes the focus completely because overthinking constantly emphasizes what is unknown. Faith pays attention to what is known. For example, perhaps you do not know exactly what the future holds, but you know God calls you to trust Him. Perhaps you do not know every detail of His plan, but you know He values obedience. Perhaps you do not know the outcome of a decision, but you know He calls you to seek wisdom. Pray sincerely and walk faithfully. These truths are not mysteries. They are already clear, and often the next step becomes visible when you stop demanding information God has not given and start responding to the truth He already has. Many believers spend enormous energy trying to discover God's hidden will, while neglecting His revealed will. They search for secret answers while ignoring clear instructions. They become consumed with future guidance while overlooking present obedience. This creates a dangerous illusion, the illusion that spiritual maturity comes from knowing more, but often spiritual maturity comes from obeying more. Knowledge has value, understanding has value, wisdom has value, but information alone does not transform lives. Obedience does. There comes a point where additional analysis no longer produces greater wisdom. It only produces greater delay, and delay can become a form of avoidance, not intentional avoidance, not rebellious avoidance, fearful avoidance. The heart tells itself it is being cautious. Meanwhile, fear quietly prevents movement. This is why overthinking often feels productive, even when nothing changes. You are mentally active, emotionally engaged, constantly evaluating, yet no actual step is taken. Days become weeks, weeks become months, months become years, and the same questions remain unresolved. Not because God has failed to guide, because fear keeps demanding a level of certainty that faith does not require. One of the most liberating realizations in the Christian life is understanding that God is not asking you to manage your entire future. He is asking you to be faithful with what is in front of you. That changes the goal completely. The goal is no longer perfect certainty. The goal becomes faithful obedience. The goal is no longer eliminating all risk. The goal becomes trusting God through risk. The goal is no longer possessing every answer. The goal becomes responding to the truth already received. This shift removes an enormous burden, because suddenly you no longer have to know everything. You only need to be faithful with what you know today. That does not mean every decision becomes easy. It does not mean uncertainty disappears. It does not mean fear never returns. But it changes the way you respond. Instead of endlessly asking, "What if?" you begin asking, "What has God already shown me?" Instead of waiting for total clarity, you begin walking in available clarity. Instead of demanding certainty, you practice trust. And something remarkable begins to happen. The grip of overthinking starts weakening. Not because every question has been answered, because you have stopped making unanswered questions the center of your life. You realize that many of your greatest struggles were never caused by lack of information. They were caused by an unwillingness to move without complete information. That realization can be uncomfortable, but it is also freeing, because it means peace does not depend on knowing everything. Peace becomes possible even when some questions remain unresolved. And that is exactly where deeper trust begins. Yet there is still one final misunderstanding that often keeps believers trapped. Even after learning to recognize fear, even after learning to trust during silence, even after learning to focus on today's responsibilities, even after learning to obey what God has already revealed, many people still approach prayer in a way that unintentionally fuels over without realizing it. Prayer becomes less about relationship and more about information gathering, less about God's presence and more about extracting certainty. And until that changes, the cycle often continues. Because the deepest freedom from spiritual overthinking is not found merely in changing your thoughts, it is found in rediscovering what prayer was meant to be all along. Prayer was never meant to become a courtroom where you present evidence, examine possibilities, and demand a final verdict from God. Yet for many believers struggling with spiritual overthinking, that is exactly what prayer has become. They enter prayer carrying lists of questions, lists of concerns, lists of scenarios, lists of possibilities. And while there is nothing wrong with bringing concerns before God, something subtle begins to happen when overthinking takes control. Prayer slowly transforms from relationship into investigation. Instead of seeking God's presence, you begin seeking certainty. Instead of drawing near to God, you begin trying to extract information from Him. Instead of resting in His care, you attempt to secure guarantees. This is one of the final and most hidden ways spiritual overthinking operates. It convinces you that peace will come after you receive enough answers. So you keep searching, keep asking, keep analyzing, keep revisiting the same questions. Not because you lack faith, because you believe the missing answer is the missing key to peace. But what if peace was never waiting on the answer? What if peace was always waiting on trust? That possibility changes everything, because many believers unknowingly approach prayer with a specific expectation. They expect prayer to remove uncertainty. They expect prayer to reveal every detail. They expect prayer to eliminate risk. And when those things do not happen immediately, frustration grows. The heart begins wondering, why isn't God answering? Why isn't He making this clearer? Why does He seem silent? Why am I still uncertain? Yet often the greatest purpose of prayer is not to remove uncertainty. It is to transform the person carrying it. That distinction is profound, because when prayer becomes primarily about gathering information, disappointment is inevitable. There will always be situations where God does not explain everything. There will always be seasons where details remain hidden. There will always be moments when complete clarity is unavailable. But if prayer is about relationship, then every prayer becomes meaningful, even when answers are delayed, even when circumstances remain unchanged, even when uncertainty continues. Many people enter prayer wanting God to change their situation. Sometimes God begins by changing their perspective. They come asking for certainty. He teaches trust. They come asking for control. He teaches surrender. They come asking for explanations. He teaches dependence. At first, this can feel disappointing because it is not what the overthinking mind wants. The overthinking mind wants information, immediate information, definite information, complete information. But God often offers something deeper. His presence, and His presence accomplishes what information alone never can. Information can answer questions, Presence can calm hearts. Information can satisfy curiosity. Presence can strengthen faith. Information can explain circumstances. Presence can carry you through them. That is why some believers discover peace long before they receive answers. Not because their questions disappear, because their relationship with God becomes stronger than their uncertainty. Think about the difference. A person can know exactly what is going to happen and still live in fear. Another person can know very little about the future and live with deep peace. The difference is not information. The difference is trust. Trust changes the entire experience of uncertainty. Without trust, uncertainty feels threatening. With trust, uncertainty becomes manageable. Without trust, unanswered questions create anxiety. With trust, unanswered questions become opportunities for dependence. Without trust, silence feels frightening. With trust, silence becomes a place of growth. This is why God's presence matters so much. Because His goal has never been merely to provide information. His goal is relationship. A relationship where trust grows. A relationship where faith matures. A relationship where dependence becomes natural. A relationship where peace no longer depends on having every answer. Many believers spend years trying to use prayer to gain control over uncertainty. Eventually, they discover that prayer was never intended to provide control. It was intended to deepen trust. That realization often feels like a burden being lifted. Suddenly, prayer no longer has to produce immediate answers to be valuable. Prayer no longer has to solve every problem. Prayer no longer has to eliminate every question. Prayer becomes a place of surrender, a place of honesty, a place of rest, a place of connection. You begin approaching God differently. Instead of saying, "Lord, tell me everything," you begin saying, "Lord, help me trust you." Instead of demanding certainty, you seek His presence. Instead of obsessing over outcomes, you focus on faithfulness. Instead of trying to control tomorrow, you learn to walk with Him today. And something remarkable happens. The pressure begins to fade. Not all at once, not overnight, but gradually. The constant striving starts losing its power. The endless need to figure everything out starts weakening. The obsession with certainty starts loosening its grip because you finally realize something important. Your security was never supposed to come from understanding everything. Your security comes from belonging to God. That truth changes how you view every uncertainty. You may not know the future, but God does. You may not understand every circumstance, but God does. You may not see the entire path, but God does. And because He does, you are free to stop carrying responsibilities that were never yours. You are free to stop demanding certainty that only He possesses. You are free to stop exhausting yourself trying to solve what can only be trusted. This does not mean life becomes easy. Questions still arise. Challenges still come. Waiting still happens. But the relationship changes. The burden shifts. The pressure decreases. And for the first time in a long time, prayer starts feeling like a conversation again, rather than an investigation. A relationship rather than a research project. A place of peace rather than mental strain. And that prepares the way for the final breakthrough. Because after everything has been examined for, silence, waiting, tomorrow's burdens, obedience, and prayer, deeper truth finally comes into view. The greatest issue was never a lack of guidance. The greatest issue was never a lack of answers. The greatest issue was never God's silence. It was the belief that you needed certainty in order to trust Him. And once that belief begins to fall apart, a completely different way of living becomes possible. A way marked not by endless analysis, but by peace. Not by control, but by surrender. Not by fear, but by faith. And that is where the journey finally reaches its resolution. The truth about spiritual overthinking is not that you think too much. The truth is deeper than that. The real issue is that somewhere along the way, you began carrying a burden that God never asked you to carry. The burden of certainty. For a long time, it may have seemed completely reasonable. You wanted to make wise decisions. You wanted to honor God. You wanted to avoid mistakes. You wanted to stay within His will. Those desires were not wrong. They were sincere. But gradually, a subtle shift occurred. Trust was replaced by analysis. Dependence was replaced by control. Faith was replaced by the pursuit of certainty. And the more certainty you chased, the more exhausted you became. Because certainty was never the destination God intended for you. Trust was. That realization changes everything. It changes how you view unanswered questions. It changes how you view God's silence. It changes how you view the future. It changes how you pray. It changes how you make decisions. Most importantly, it changes how you view your relationship with God. Many believers live as though God has hidden His will behind an impossible puzzle, as though one wrong move will destroy everything, as though His plans are so fragile that a single imperfect decision can ruin them forever. But that picture of God creates fear, not faith. It creates pressure, not peace. It creates anxiety, not confidence. The reality is far different. God is not sitting in heaven hoping you fail. He is not waiting for opportunities to condemn honest mistakes. He is not withholding love until you achieve perfect discernment. He is not demanding flawless performance. He is a faithful Father, a wise Father, a patient Father, a Father whose ability to guide you is greater than your ability to misunderstand Him. Pause and let that truth settle into your heart. God's ability to lead is greater than your ability to miss Him. For so many people, that single realization brings enormous relief. Because they have spent years living under pressure. Pressure to hear perfectly. Pressure to understand perfectly. Pressure to decide perfectly. Pressure to perform perfectly. Yet God has never called His children to perfection of understanding. He has called them to faithfulness. Faithfulness looks different than perfection. Faithfulness says, I will trust God with what I cannot see. Faithfulness says, I will obey what He has already shown me. Faithfulness says, I will walk forward even when every question is not answered. Faithfulness says, I will rely on God's character more than my own ability to predict the future. That is a completely different way of living, and it is far lighter than the life of overthinking. The overthinking life is exhausting because it places impossible responsibilities on your shoulders. It tells you that everything depends on you. Your future, your success, your protection, your certainty, your understanding. Everything becomes your responsibility. No wonder you became tired. No wonder your mind felt overwhelmed. No wonder peace seemed distant. You were attempting to carry what only God can carry. And every human being eventually breaks under that weight. But faith offers another way. Faith does not require you to know everything. Faith requires you to trust the one who does. Faith does not require control. Faith requires surrender. Faith does not require certainty. Faith requires confidence in God's character. That is why spiritual maturity is not measured by how many answers you possess. It is measured by how deeply you trust God. When answers are incomplete, anyone can feel secure when the path is obvious. Anyone can feel confident when outcomes are guaranteed. Anyone can feel peaceful when uncertainty disappears. But trust grows strongest when clarity remains limited. That is where faith becomes real. That is where dependence becomes genuine. That is where spiritual growth takes root. Perhaps today you still have unanswered questions. Perhaps there are decisions you are still praying about. Perhaps there are circumstances you do not understand. Perhaps there are seasons of waiting that continue longer than you expected. Perhaps God still seems quieter than you would like. But none of those realities mean you have been abandoned. None of them mean you are outside His care. None of them mean He has forgotten you. None of them mean you are lost. The presence of uncertainty is not evidence of God's absence. The presence of unanswered questions is not evidence of God's rejection. And the presence of waiting is not evidence that He has stopped working. Sometimes the greatest evidence of faith is not having all the answers. It is continuing to trust while answers remain incomplete. That is where freedom begins. Freedom begins when you stop trying to control every outcome. Freedom begins when you stop demanding certainty before obedience. Freedom begins when you stop treating every anxious thought as truth. Freedom begins when you stop carrying tomorrow's burdens today. Freedom begins when prayer becomes relationship again. Freedom begins when trust becomes greater than fear. Imagine how different life becomes when you no longer need to figure everything out. Imagine waking up without feeling responsible for controlling the future. Imagine making decisions based on prayer, wisdom, and faith rather than endless mental analysis. Imagine being able to rest even when every detail remains unknown. Imagine experiencing peace in the middle of uncertainty. That is not a fantasy. That is the kind of freedom God desires for His children. Not a life without questions, a life where questions no longer rule. Not a life without uncertainty, a life where uncertainty no longer controls. Not a life without challenges, a life where challenges no longer destroy peace. Because peace was never supposed to come from understanding everything. Peace comes from trusting God, and trust grows when His truth becomes greater than your anxious thoughts. So today, perhaps the invitation is simpler than you imagined. Not to figure everything out, not to solve every mystery, not to eliminate every risk, not to force every answer, but to trust that God is faithful, to trust that He is present, to trust that He is guiding you even when the path is not fully visible, to trust that His love is not dependent on your perfect understanding, to trust that His sovereignty is greater than your uncertainty, and to trust that the future is safest in His hands, not yours. The truth about spiritual overthinking is that God never intended you to carry the burden of certainty. He never asked you to know everything. He never asked you to control everything. He never asked you to predict everything. He asked you to trust Him. And when that truth finally settles into your heart, something beautiful happens. Fear begins to loosen its grip. The mind becomes quieter. Prayer becomes genuine again. Waiting becomes more bearable. Obedience becomes simpler. And faith becomes stronger, one step at a time, one day at a time, one act of trust at a time. If this message encouraged you, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more biblical wisdom that helps you walk through life's challenges with faith and clarity. And remember this, you do not need to know everything about the road ahead when you know the one who walks with you.